This will be the final lecture for the course. It's going to be rather long, I'm afraid. There was a French writer who once said in a letter, I'm sorry this letter is so long, I lack the time to make it shorter. And that's the situation in which I find myself today. At the end of the semester, all kinds of things is going on, but probably one of the biggest things that's going on for me personally is that one of my PhD advisees, somebody that I've been working with for 5 or 6 years now, has completed his dissertation. He's going to get his PhD on May 8th at the commencement, as a number of you are going to be getting your own diplomas, and it's a big moment for him. And to wrap things up for him and get him across the finish line in terms of just the final paperwork and so forth, that's consumed a lot of today. So although this is going to be kind of a long lecture, you won't be held responsible for all of it. I'll divide what you need to know this week from what you'll need to know for next week. And also a lot of it is conceptual. So even though there's a lot of slides and so on, there's not a tremendous amount of information here. A lot of it is conceptual. Okay, let me share the screen with you. And here we go. Here are the terms. And by the end of this presentation, you should understand first the definition of total war. And that's probably the single most important thing to get out of this lecture. Next, the main elements of modern war and total war. The two things kind of elide into one another. Third, the causes, conduct, and consequences of the U.S. Civil War, which we're going to look at as one example of modern war. The distinction between a strategy of attrition and a strategy of annihilation. And then the causes, conduct, and consequences of the Franco-Prussian War, which occurred just 5 years after the conclusion of the American Civil War, was sort of the second most important modern war in the European, North American experience in the 19th century, and offered lessons that were different from the American Civil War and ultimately sort of seductive and misleading lessons. We'll get into that. You'll need to know something about the Prussian military system and its influence. Prussia, during the Franco-Prussian War, actually succeeds in unifying all of Germany. And so you get German unification. And so after the war, it's proper to think in terms of the German military system and its influence. And finally, the major lesson of military history, as far as I'm concerned. Okay, first of all, a working definition of total war. What it is not is the erosion of the distinction between combatants and non-combatants. People don't know anything about war, think of total war as something that that emerged in the 20th century, and they're wrong. You've seen enough of military history in this course to recognize that historically, non-combatants have not been exempt from the violence of war. One example would be the sack of Magdeburg during the 30 Years' War, or to look at the 30 Years' War in its totality. So you already know about that. Well, what is it? It involves the complete or near complete mobilization of a society. Okay. By the way, this is my own definition, but it is the correct definition, and there's no definition that's superior to it. So pay attention. Okay. Coupled with the application of violence against a wide spectrum of the enemy's society. So complete or near complete mobilization on the one hand, and then the application of violence against a large spectrum of the enemy's society. Okay. And this high level of mobilization requires nationalism, which you've looked at, industrialization, which we'll talk about in a bit, and urbanization, those three elements. And you begin to get this kind of mobilization with the French Revolution. So prior to that, you're not really talking about modern war. You're talking about something different. And the application of violence across a broad spectrum of the enemy society is based in part upon the inability to defeat an enemy on the battlefield alone. That's sort of the holy grail of what armies try to do. They try to defeat the bad guys on the battlefield, win a swift victory, total victory, so forth. Never happens. And then what always occurs is when you cannot defeat an enemy on the battlefield, then you shift toward attacks upon civilians. Okay. And this gets coupled in the modern era with an ideological belief in the need for the total destruction of an adversary. So war is cast as a struggle between good and evil. And this is the secular equivalent of the religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries. It's the same thing come back again. And so this kind of war is the antithesis of wars based on raison d'etat. These were wars for limited objectives. These were wars in which a negotiated outcome was assumed. These were wars in which the adversary was sort of kind of a mirror image of yourself. Everybody was jostling for position in a balance of power contest, and it was kind of nothing personal. It was just business. The French Revolution began to sort of blast that way of looking at war out of existence. It took time to go away entirely, but over time it did. And the modern wars of the mid-19th century, the American Civil War, the Franco-Prussian War, there's some others too we won't get into, are a way station on the road to 20th century total war. And sort of the quintessential total wars are World War I and World War II. And then in my childhood, we lived under the constant threat of a nuclear war, sort of a general nuclear exchange that would have been, a total war in the absolute sense, in terms of the destruction of humanity. Talk about the American Civil War a bit. The causes of the American Civil War, you'll sometimes hear it said, well, the American Civil War was about states' rights. It was a context over states' rights. Well, no, it wasn't, and I will tell you why. The idea is that the South believed in states' rights, limited government, but the North somehow believed in a kind of a centralized government, and that's just baloney. Both sides believed in states' rights. The kind of states' rights that the South believed in was a sort of instrumental variety that was designed to protect slavery. And the giveaway for this is twofold. The first is the Fugitive Slave Act, passed in 1850. The South insisted upon this. What this federal law did, that they insisted upon, was a law that overrode personal liberty laws passed in a number of northern states. And these personal liberty laws basically said, if you are an owner coming to collect a fugitive slave, or the agent of an owner coming to collect a fugitive slave, this involved due process. You have to go to court. You have to demonstrate to a certain standard that the African-American person that you're claiming is your property is indeed your property. And the threshold was high enough that Southern slaveholders got upset with it and thought it was unfair and so forth, and insisted upon this fugitive slave law, federal law, that overrode the states' rights of northern states. Another thing is you just read what the first states to secede, and if you look at this map, you'll see the sort of the ones in the red, the Deep South. These ones seceded immediately after the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. And then before the firing on Fort Sumter that sort of brought the Upper South into the war, these Deep South states sent what were called sort of apostles of disunion, agents to the various Upper South states, explaining why you should join us, why you should secede and become part of the Confederate States of America like us. And what they said over and over again is protection of slavery, and the terrible consequences that would occur if slavery went away. Everything from setting loose a titanic slave rebellion like the Saint-Domingue revolt, or sort of miscegenation, a mixing of the races, African Americans and white Americans, getting married and so forth, and or having sex or this kind of thing, dogs and cats living together in sin, this kind of a thing, sort of the mongrelization of the white race. I mean, everything that you could come up with to get people to freak out over what the destruction of slavery would involve was invoked by these apostles of disunion. Now, the rational reason to preserve slavery, and this was something that people understood, was that it was the economic basis of the American South. So Southern slaveholders did not want to get rid of slavery because that was what their wealth was based upon, and they also did not believe that a South without slavery was economically viable. So that's sort of the non-hysterical explanation for why the war was over slavery. And everybody understood from the very beginning that the war was about slavery. When you look at the letters of Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers alike, and when they talk about what the war is about, slavery comes up over and over again. They don't talk about states' rights or anything along those kinds of lines. Well, the South is a slave-holding society, and that means that was not economically viable without slavery. So you have a very wide slaveholding, and this slavery, which treated people as legally as chattel property, not as human beings, generated so much wealth that if you look at the import-export ratio of the United States in 1860, the bulk of American exports, what's going abroad, and it's a huge amount, comes from the products of slavery, chiefly raw cotton sent to British factories and so forth, or textiles created in the United States itself. And the foundations of American industrialization ultimately track back to the wealth created directly or indirectly by slavery. Now, in Great Britain, you had what was called the Industrial Revolution. This was the replacement of animal power with mechanical power, water-driven power, steam-driven power, and the amount of energy involved with this kind of release allowed for the creation of large manufacturing. This process begins in Great Britain in 1750, and it begins to spread into Europe and into the United States, and it's just beginning to really get underway in the United States when the American Civil War breaks out. So this industrialization is one feature of the American Civil War, and for that matter, the Franco-Prussian War. Another one that you may not think about is literacy. 50, 60, some 70 years before, many Americans were not literate. They could not read or write, certainly not very well. But by the 1840s and 50s and 60s, Americans could read. And this had consequences for the war in very, very basic kinds of ways. Because of literacy, it became possible for citizens to read about the political affairs of the day, to be influenced by what politicians said in the way of rhetoric about the North is evil because of this reason, the South is evil because of this reason. And this leads in turn to the phenomenon of citizen soldiers in the true sense of the term. Americans in the mid-19th century were among the most politically active Americans ever. We're doing well nowadays if we get 60% of the population to turn out in a presidential election. In mid-19th century America, it was common for all elections to generate participation rates of upwards of 80%. Now, African Americans couldn't vote, women couldn't vote. I get all of that, but among those who could vote, the voting was very high because people believed that voting mattered, that there were sort of dragons to slay on the other side, and that there were things at stake in terms of the kind of country that you wanted to have. And so when the Civil War broke out, you had this phenomenon of tens of thousands and ultimately hundreds of thousands of Americans, North and South, volunteering to fight in a war that they understood the political stakes of. So these were not people fighting for, home and hearth or going off on adventure or something like that. These soldiers had a good solid understanding, perhaps a mistaken understanding, but a good solid understanding of the political ideology involved. So on the left, I've got a picture of a county election. On the right, I've got a photograph of a Virginia militia unit at the outset of the war to kind of illustrate the point. There are new technologies involved in the American Civil War, and you see them in Europe as well, but we'll use the example from the American Civil War. The first was the railroad. The railroad, was again mechanically based, and it allowed for larger armies to move from one place to another with greater rapidity. It allowed for the transfer of supplies on a large scale. It really made possible the American Civil War, the way that it was fought in terms of an expanse, because the size of the theater of war, from say Richmond, Virginia to Dallas, Texas, the same distance as between Paris and Moscow. You're dealing with just a huge expanse. The railroad made this war on this kind of scale possible. Next, you have the telegraph. The telegraph had been invented in the late 1830s. By this time, it was pretty common in the United States, North and South, and also in Europe. And the thing about this was the telegraph, in a military sense, enabled military intelligence, military information, to go from point A to point B very rapidly. And so before the advent of the telegraph, if you were the head of state and you wanted to influence what was going on the field of battle, you had to be somebody like the Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, accompanying your armies into battle. You couldn't influence operations otherwise. The telegraph made it possible for people in Washington or people in Richmond, the policymakers, to influence strategy, operations, tactics, at all levels. And at the same time, you also had the telegraph instantly communicating information about what was going on in the political realm, the military realm, and so forth, to this literate American population that read newspapers, that read news weeklies, and so on. So in terms of the ability to move information, masses of information rapidly from one place to another, the telegraph was a very important innovation. You also see a technological innovation that is sort of deceptively simple, and that's the advent of the rifled musket. Now, before this, you had muskets, in the 17th century, 18th century, looked a lot like Civil War muskets. The Civil War musket was important for two reasons. The first is that if you look at the hammer of this rifled musket, you look at what the hammer comes down on. It's not coming down on a flint. It's not a piece of steel striking a flint and then creating a spark, and that goes into the barrel and sets off the charge and this kind of a thing. It's not like that. What you're dealing with instead is a percussion cap made of mercury fulminate. And when that hammer comes down, the percussion cap goes off. It creates a spark that goes into the barrel. The barrel fires, and so you got greater reliability, much greater reliability, much reduced rate of misfires. And the second thing is, this is the more important thing, is that they figured out how to create a rifle that was as easy to load as a smoothbore. The problem with rifles up until this time was that you're dealing with the rifle, the grooves in the barrel, and to get a bullet to take those grooves so that it would spin the way it was, and it was the spinning effect coming out that made rifles shoot further and more accurately. This was just something that was impractical on a battlefield. You could not load a rifle fast. Well, in 1839, a French captain named Claude Minier invented this thing called the Minier ball, sometimes called the mini ball. Now look at this thing. Okay, it is cylindroconoidal. All right, and it's better really to see this thing three-dimensionally, but we'll settle for what we've got. Okay, if you look at the right side, this is the side view of the bullet. You can see that it's got three bands. Okay, and it looks just like it looks like just kind of like a regular regular slug, much like what a smoothbore would fire. But if you look at the left thing, this might be a little hard to imagine, but just give it a second. What you've got is an indentation in the bullet. So what you're looking at now is from the bottom of the bullet, okay? And there's this kind of indentation, sort of it's kind of like a bowl. That's basically the thing. So now what happens is you can slide that bullet, that mini ball, right down the barrel as easy as you could with smoothbore ball. Slide it down, and when you get the ignition of the gunpowder, what happens, and this is beautiful in its simplicity, what happens is the explosive power of the gunpowder widens that bowl large enough that the mini ball takes the rifle grooving of the musket smoothly. So now you've got a militarily efficient rifle that is more reliable and shoots farther than the smoothbore. What's a real question is whether the Civil War bullets that could go farther were actually used at a greater distance, but that's not something we're going to get into. What you are dealing with is a major milestone on the road to modern weaponry. You also have new technologies in the form of ironclads. At the beginning of the American Civil War, the British were experimenting with iron clad warships. These had, instead of having wooden hulls, these had iron hulls, later steel hulls. So this is a recognizably modern development. Both the Union and the Confederacy developed ironclad warships. What you see in the distance is the CSS Virginia, a ram that was created by the Confederacy in 1861, 1862. And what you see in the foreground is the USS Monitor, which is, it looks like a cheese box on a raft. But if you look at the thing that looks like a cheese box, what that really is a turret. It's got just two guns, but those two guns with the turret can move in 360-degree direction. And this becomes the basis for modern warships. If you look at modern battleships, cruisers, and everything else, they all use the turret as the basic way in which they aim and fire their artillery. Then you have something called the fiscal military revolution. Okay, and the first thing to notice is you see this graph, this bar graph, in every American history textbook. And what it shows you is, boy, the Union had 71% of the population. The South only had 29%. Factories in the North produced 91% of the output. The South only 9%, and so forth and on and on and on. What gets overlooked is that these advantages that the North had, or the Union had, were latent advantages. The factories might produce weapons and cannon and uniforms and all kinds of stuff like that, but they weren't going to sell it to the government for free. The government had to be able to pay for it. And the government historically had low levels of taxation based upon custom imports. When goods were imported into the country, the merchants who bought the goods, paid a tax on it, and then that tax was sort of spread indirectly to the population, and that's how it was done. During the American Civil War, every 90 days, the entire 1860 budget of the U.S. government was exhausted. And so what this meant was that it was just flat impossible for the Union government to run the war, without making major revisions in the way in which it conducted its financial affairs. Now, so what you get, and I wish I could go into this in greater detail because it's beautiful, is this artful balance between what are called greenbacks, and these are paper. This is paper money that is legal tender. Now, what it means, legal tender, is that you hand this dollar bill to somebody, they have to take it. Okay, it is not like in the South where this is a treasury, this is a banknote or whatever. Well, I don't like this bank so much, I'm not going to take that particular dollar. This you have to take. This is legal tender in the same way that modern dollar bills are. You might think those have been around forever. No. So you have that. You have an income tax for the first time. You have customs taxes on an array of goods. You had that before, but this gets expanded. You have a national banking act that is created, and you have the sale of bonds, war bonds. And the great thing about these bonds was that they were intended to be purchased, by even ordinary people. It used to be that that only big investors would buy bonds. And what a bond is the government says, hey, we need money. We want you to loan us your money. We'll pay it back at interest, and so forth. And the way that the union government did it was, hey, we will pay you back 7% interest in gold. This was awesome. And so you put this together: a national banking act, income taxes, expanded excise taxes, and this bond system, and the American, the U.S. government is able to finance the war at an inflation rate that is comparable to that of the United States in World War I and World War II. Okay. So this is what happens with the Confederacy. The Confederacy never figures out how to finance its war. It uses an outmoded system that's kind of a pre-war system. They can't revise it fast enough. And if you look at the consumer price index over the course of the war, you see that the Union one, the blue line at the bottom, is essentially flat lines. It goes up some, to be sure, but look what happens with the Confederacy as time goes on. And it looks as if the Confederacy's chances are less and less. Confederate money is worth progressively less and less, because it all depends upon a promise by the Confederate government to pay off the debt within 2 years after the conclusion of a peace treaty with the United States. Well, once it looks like the Confederacy's not going to win, that Confederate money is worth less and less and less. And by the end of the war, the Confederacy is dealing with an inflation rate of 8,000%. You want to know one big reason the North wins the war? It is this fiscal military revolution. Now, the war starts off as a limited war in which the South is fighting for, or the Confederate South is fighting for, its independence. It basically takes the view that, hey, the union between the various states is contingent, and you can join the union or you can secede from it, you can leave the union, and that's okay. That's the basic political theory of the Deep South and the Upper South. Okay. And they want to leave the union because they want to protect slavery. They're really suspicious of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln and the Republican Party says, we're not interested in destroying slavery. We're just interested in preventing the spread of slavery into Western territories. Don't worry about it. But Southern slaveholders do. And so, but the original Union objective is reunion. And what they say to white Southerners, and only one Southern family in 4 owned any slaves at all. And these had all been good Americans, just a few months before Lincoln's election. What they basically say is, look, the secessionists have hoodwinked you into leaving the Union. They have talked about this apocalyptic doom that awaits you, if you don't become part of the Confederate States of America. Well, we're going to come down. We're going to prove otherwise. We are not going to touch slavery, for one thing. We're going to protect your property, your houses and stuff like that. And by the way, the Union armies really did this. And we're not going to take your crops and that kind of thing. And we're not going to disturb slavery. We are going to be neutral about slavery. We're going to be neither, this is the way it was expressed, neither Negro stealers nor Negro catchers. So this idea was basically designed to sort of to appeal to everybody. We are not going to take the slaves of Americans who have property in slaves. That would be Negro stealing, that element of it. And in terms um, um, of what of catching um, uh, escaped slaves, we're not going to be in the business of doing that either. We're just going to be carefully neutral on the question of slavery. Well, immediately, the slaves themselves took that off the table because they came into Union lines, and then Union forces were faced with a decision. Are we going to return the slaves to their owners, or are we going to keep them as cooks, laundrymen, laborers, or whatever? They had to do one thing or the other. And so African Americans themselves, enslaved Americans themselves, began to sort of push the country toward emancipation well before Lincoln adopted a policy of emancipation. When people say Lincoln freed the slaves, they're like, kind of, sort of, maybe, but there's a lot more going on. To some extent, enslaved Americans didn't so much free themselves, that's too much to say, but really participated in an active way in their own freedom. So in 1861 and 1862, the Union government attempted to win victory on the battlefield. Basically, they wanted to destroy the Confederate government and reunify the country the way that it had been. By mid-1862, it was clear that a victory on the battlefield could not be won. And so one thing that occurs is that Lincoln sort of officially adds emancipation to reunion as a war aim. And what this means is that now the war becomes a war to reshape the political, social, economic, and cultural fabric of the American South. What he talked about in one of his speeches, presidential addresses, and saying, I want to avoid what could become a remorseless revolutionary struggle, where emancipation essentially unleashes precisely that kind of struggle. And it's intended to reshape the South, and ultimately it's going to reshape the entire country. Now, why go after, why try to end slavery as a war aim? Well, because the economic basis of the Confederacy, is slavery. You destroy slavery and you cut the economic props out from under the Confederacy. The other cool thing about it is you can mobilize African American manpower, and by 1863, that's underway in earnest. And ultimately, 186,000 African American men serve in the Union Army. Another way in which the war becomes sort of unleashed and much broader and much closer to a total war. Never quite gets to being a total war, but again, Union armies discover that they cannot defeat Confederate armies on the battlefield. The armies are just too big, both sides. They cannot win a decisive victory over the other. And so what happens, as happens so many times in war, is when you cannot defeat an enemy army on the field of battle, you go for the civilians. And in the case of the American Civil War, the Union Army between 1863 and 1865, most famously with Sherman's marches and so forth, goes after Southern property, not Southern people. You don't have murders and assaults and this kind of a thing. One of the interesting things about it is you don't get something like the 30 Years' War, or the devastation of the Palatinate during the wars of the 18th century. This is one of the interesting things about it, is that the Union Army goes so far and no further. But it is a very damaging war, and it is a strategy of attrition, of wearing down the Confederacy, in the context of a strategy of annihilation and the sort of the ultimate destruction of the Confederacy, but no longer a strategy of annihilation in the sense of destroying Confederate armies on the battlefield. The North continues to try to do that. Of course, naturally you would, but deliberate attacks on Confederate property, Southern property, become as important as the fighting on the battlefield. And so by 1865, the Confederacy is in fact, destroyed. It goes out of existence. The sequel to this is not peace, but rather an insurgency in the post-war South, in which most white Southerners are interested in sort of recreating the pre-war sort of subordination of African Americans and the forced labor of African Americans in a context other than slavery, just sort of a modified thing. And they're willing to use violence in order to do it. And you're talking about thousands of politically motivated deaths during the Reconstruction era. So the Civil War just doesn't bring about, is it a contest for human freedom? No, not really. Ultimately, it's a contest to create the Jim Crow South. That's as far as it goes. But nevertheless, the Confederacy is destroyed, and it is a modern war effort that does it. Now, switch over and look at what's going on in Europe. Between 1815, which is the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and 1914, almost exactly a century, Europe enjoyed 100 years free of any general war involving most of the major powers. Now, individual countries continued to fight one another, and I could reel off a number of those wars. But the one that I want to look at is a war between Prussia and France. This is part of an international competition, the same jockeying for position and balance of power and raison d'etat, all this kind of stuff in the 18th century, but also infused with the ideology of nationalism. If you look at this is not, don't think of this as a unified Germany. Look at this as sort of the components of the ultimate unified Germany. What you're looking at are German-speaking kingdoms, German-speaking principalities, and so on. Okay? And these have been separate from one another for centuries. But with nationalism, there's the sense that we speak a common language, we have common customs, manners, a common heritage. We identify with one another, and so it is nationalism. We've already seen this in the French Revolution. It is nationalism that propels Germans to find attractive the idea of becoming one. Okay. Now, there are forces that resist this, okay? And then it becomes a matter of who's going to be first among equals if Germany is unified, and the first among equals is going to be Prussia. Okay. And the way that Prussia gets the rest of the German states to unify with it is through military action. There is a war in 1866 between Prussia and Austria, which is the other German-speaking state that might have been the basis on which German nationalism could have occurred. The Prussians beat the Austrians in about 6 weeks. But the main thing is a war between France and Prussia in 1870-71. Now, take a look at the Prussian military, because this is the beginnings of the modern military, the way that you see it in the First World War and the Second World War. Okay. First of all, the Prussian military went through major reforms after being defeated by Napoleon, in the Napoleonic Wars. They did a number of reforms. There's not enough time to get into them. But one of them was the creation of a general staff, where you had officers, these guys on the right, these are Prussian staff officers, the brightest officers, who were especially selected and educated to understand war, the management of violence to a very high degree. And at the top of the general staff was the chief of the general staff, and during the Franco-Prussian War, this was a guy named Helmuth von Moltke. And the way that the German general staff system worked was Moltke was the brains of the army, and the officers were the nervous system of the army. And what these officers could do, and they'd be majors and lieutenant colonels and colonels and so forth, is they could go from place to place, and they could go to another Prussian general, somebody who outranked them, and they could say to this German general, what you're doing is wrong. It does not conform to the commander's intent. Here's what you need to do instead. And the generals knew that these officers were speaking with the voice of the chief of the general staff. It was a very efficient, very effective way of organizing armies operationally. It worked very, very well. Another thing that the Prussians had and that the Germans eventually adopted was a conscription system. The American Civil War was fired by citizen soldiers volunteering by hundreds of thousands. Okay, but the German conscription system operated differently. First of all, at the age of 20, all civilian men, enter 2 years of active duty training, 2 years of their infantry, 3 years for cavalry and artillery. This is mandatory. Age 20, you go into the military, and that's it. That's the name of that tune. Then between ages of 22 or 23, you go into the reserves for 4 or 5 years, the frontline reserves. Then your service is not over yet. Then at age 26 to 27, you go into the Landwehr, second line reserve unit. And it doesn't end there. Between age 37 and 38, you go into the Landsturm, the third line reserve, and you stay into the military until age 45. So you've got soldiers who are in the armed forces, the military for 25 years. And how does that work? How do you get civilians to do this? Well, they do it willingly because of nationalism, the sense of identification with the state. You've seen it with the French Revolution. Well, it is what makes the conscription system work. And what this does is it enables the Prussian army, later the German army in wartime, to expand very quickly, efficiently, and effectively, because you've got an active duty force, yes, but it's comparatively small. But within a few weeks, you can augment that with first line reservists, and then if you need to, second line reservists, and then if you need to, third line reservists. And so armies can become much larger as a result of this conscription system. And after the Franco-Prussian War, all European powers, except Great Britain, adopted conscription. And so in 1914, when millions of men go off to war, when World War I begins, it is the conscription system that enables these millions of men in armies to mobilize and go off to war so quickly, and for wars to, and for climactic battles to occur so swiftly and so bloodily. There are technological innovations during the Franco-Prussian War as well, and we'll deal with these briefly. These things look like normal muskets. They're not, though. They're breech loaders. And basically, this is like the modern thing now. No longer do you take a weapon and you put the bullet in at the end of the muzzle. You put the bullet in at the breech. This is just the way it's done now. Well, this allows for a rifle to be fired, reloaded, fired again, and so forth, much more rapidly than could be done with a muzzle loader. Muzzle loader, you'd be lucky to get off 3 shots in a minute. Breech loader, you could do 7, 8 shots, 10 shots in a minute, depending on the efficiency of the weapon. You also get, on the part of the French, something called the mitrailleuse. Okay, and this is the beginnings of a machine gun. And you see the same kind of a thing in the United States in the form of the Gatling gun. Or in the Wars of Empire, we've already looked at the Maxim gun, invented by Hiram Maxim. And these are the precursors of the machine guns that dominate the battlefield in the First World War. And boy, I wish I could tell you about how this is done, but the Prussians, the war begins in July of 1870. By the beginning of September 1870, just a couple of months, right? Even less than that, the Prussians and the German kingdom, other German kingdoms that are allied with the Prussians in this war, have defeated the main French army, forced it to surrender to a place called Sedan. And then the other portion of the French army is besieged at a place called Metz and has to surrender in October. And this is enormously attractive to all militaries, because what you want to do is, if you can win a war quickly and decisively and on the battlefield, that's what you want to do. And so armies the world over, including that of the United States, looked at the German example, the Hauptschlacht, the decisive battle, because they think, hey, the Germans are able to pull this off. Let's study how they do it. And interestingly, the Americans, who'd emerged from a civil war that had been won by attrition over a period of years, once they see what happens in the Franco-Prussian War, they go back to the Civil War and they mine it selectively for examples of what looked like decisive battles, and basically ignore the fact that the war was fought and won through a gradual process of attrition. And between the Hauptschlacht, the decisive battle, sort of the swift achievement of victory and victory over won by attrition, the most common way in which wars play out is the failure to gain victory immediately and decisively, and wars playing out over time through a process of attrition. I'm giving this this recorded presentation at the end of April 2022, and at the moment, the Russian army that has invaded Ukraine and expected to win a swift victory is getting bogged down in a war of attrition that could very well go on for months or years. This is not uncommon. Well, as a result of this common war effort, military effort against France, the Franco-Prussian War, this succeeds in uniting Germany. And so united Germany quite quickly takes its place in the heart of Europe as a major, and by 1913, the major economic player in Europe. And so in the 18th century, 17th, 18th century, France is the power, the hegemonic power that needs to be sort of, contained. After the Franco-Prussian War, increasingly it looks like it's Germany. United Germany is the problem. It's the issue. If you look over the left side of this map, right where it says France, if you go a little east of France, or to the right, you'll see Lorraine and Alsace. These are regions that had mixed population of French speakers and German speakers. I won't go into all the details of the historical past, but the fact of the matter is these had a mix of French speakers and German speakers. Lorraine and Alsace had been part of France, however, for about 2 centuries at this point. The Germans annexed both of those provinces, both Alsace and Lorraine. They just took them from France. This was something the French did not forget. And what you see after the Franco-Prussian War is this sense of revenge. We need to look for the moment when we can pay back the Germans for what they have done to us. And the Germans forced the French to pay a major indemnity, a lot of money and so forth after the war, which the French, by the way, did pretty rapidly. But the thing that really rankled many Frenchmen was the loss of Alsace and Lorraine. And what you see here is a painting done in 1887 by a guy named Albert Bataillé. It's called La Tache Noire, the black spot. And the black spot is Alsace and Lorraine. That's what it represents. Okay? And the idea is this teacher is making sure this young kid understands, what the Germans did to to France. And so you got generations of French people believing, with varying degrees of fervency, that the moment will come, the moment must come when France and Germany will square off again in a war of revenge. Well, in 1914, it happens. And all of Europe in 1914 goes off to war rather gaily. Um, they understand that it's going to be a very bloody war, but they think it's got to be brief. And the fires of nationalism, burn very brightly, and probably no more brightly than in France and Germany. Well, the result of this is a 4-year war in which there are 9.7 million military deaths, 9.7 million military deaths, and then 10 million civilian deaths, mostly due to disease and malnutrition. France alone has 1.4 million military deaths, 40,000 civilians directly due to the war, 300,000 indirectly to the war. That is to say, 4.3% of the population of France dies. And what you're looking at here is a major ossuarian cemetery at a place called Verdun. Verdun was the scene of a 10-month battle between the Germans and the French in 1916. And even today, the word Verdun is spoken by the French with reverence and national pride. What you're dealing with in this battle of Verdun, what this involved was the death of 163,000 French soldiers and the wounding of 216,000 French soldiers. And you're looking at in the cemetery 16,142 French graves, but this is just the dead French soldiers whose bodies could be, were like together enough that you could realize, oh, this is one human being, and we can put them in a grave. What you've got instead is this ossuary in which you have the skeletal remains of at least 130,000 French and Germans, all mixed together, all blown apart, blasted apart over and over again by ceaseless artillery shelling. This is what revanchism is about. This is what this war of revenge turns out to be. This is what payback with the Franco-Prussian War leads to. And when the war ends, of course, 1918, it doesn't create peace. 20 years later, you get the Second World War. And this leads to sort of the basic lesson of military history. And I will close with this. It would be wrong to say that wars never solve problems. They can and they do solve problems, but they do so at the expense of creating equivalent or greater problems down the line. And so war is ultimately a trap from which we may or may not escape. And as a military historian, I couldn't tell you one way or the other. I think that there's strong cause for pessimism, but some cause for optimism. But the idea of going to war in the expectation that you'll solve a problem permanently is moonshine. It just doesn't work that way. And as citizens, if in no other way, we have a responsibility to really understand what our government or what policymakers or opinion makers are talking about when they think in terms of using military strength anywhere in the world. I'll end with that.